David J. Silverman is a professor of history at George Washington University. He is the author of several books on Native American, colonial American, and American racial history, including This Land is Their Land, the Wampanoag Indians' Plymouth Colony, and the Troubled History of Thanksgiving, and Thundersticks, Firearms and the Violent Transformation of Native America. He is the recent recipient of the William Hickling Prescott Award for Excellence in Historical Writing, given by the Massachusetts branch of the National Society of the Colonial Dames of America. His essays have appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, National Geographic, and the Daily Beast. Please welcome Professor Silverman.
Thanks, Deborah, and thanks to the Sutro Library for inviting me to speak with you today. I'm looking forward to our conversation after my formal remarks. Let me begin this talk here today with a warning and with some contextual remarks. The warning is this: I'm going to provide you with plenty of ammunition to ruin your family's Thanksgivings this year, for those of you who are able to hold a Thanksgiving this year. Of course, I'm aware that some of you are perfectly capable of ruining your family's holiday all by yourself with no assistance from me, but you'll have more material with which to work this year once we're done with this talk. I also want to note that it might be jarring to some members of this audience to see the word Indians in my book title and to hear me use it during this discussion tonight. After all, we're all aware that Indians is a misnomer that was propagated by Europeans. I don't know where all of you are located, given that we're meeting remotely here, but most of us are not in India. Now, in recent decades, many people have substituted the term Native Americans for Indians in an effort to be more accurate and racially sensitive. Yet, in the course of my many years of interactions with indigenous people across the United States, I've learned that most of them, certainly not all, but most, favor the term Indian when referring to them in the aggregate. In other words, over the generations, many indigenous people in what's now the United States have appropriated the term Indian and made it a source of pride. I should also emphasize that almost to a person, they prefer tribal names when appropriate. My point is that it's out of deference and not indifference that I use this word. Let me also emphasize that though my book and this talk tonight focuses on historical Wampanoag people and strives to include their voices at every turn, if my surname didn't give it away, I'm not Wampanoag. And this isn't a history told from a modern Wampanoag perspective. To be sure, my conversations with modern Wampanoag people have informed the content. Indeed, I wrote this book in no small part because of what Wampanoag people told me over the years about how difficult Thanksgiving season was for them and their children year after year. Nevertheless, there's some content in this talk and in my book that some Wampanoag people will consider dubious, outright wrong, and even none of my business as an outsider. I've done my best to weigh those criticisms in advance by soliciting responses to drafts of this book from historically minded Wampanoag colleagues, and by discussing my ideas with Wampanoag audiences open to hearing them. I even shadowed the Wampanoag staff at the Plymouth Plantation Living History Museum the week before Thanksgiving in advance of finishing the first draft of this book. I offered my Wampanoag friends and colleagues that they could include dissenting opinions in this book alongside my own interpretations, all the while acknowledging that the playing field is uneven, given that I'm the author. Ultimately, the responsibility for all editorial decisions in this book and in this talk tonight belong to me alone. And in the final analysis, I've had to make a number of tough choices based on the standards of my discipline of history. So I want to urge everyone here tonight, and anyone who reads my book, to seek out the Wampanoag's own tellings of this history. And all you have to do is go to Google and search Wampanoag Thanksgiving history, and you'll find that these tellings are widely available in print, on film, and online. My hope is that Wampanoag and other indigenous people will see here an informed and well-intentioned attempt to fulfill the Indian call to take Indian history seriously within the context of a greater American history. And so with that context, for generations, Americans have been telling themselves a patriotic story of the supposed first Thanksgiving that treats colonization as a consensual, bloodless affair. In this tale, the Pilgrims, religious dissenters from England, cram aboard the Mayflower to brave the stormy Atlantic in search of freedom of conscience in America. These sea-tossed adventurers land off Cape Cod with a fresh copy of their proto-constitution, the Mayflower Compact. And after some fruitless exploring and brief contacts with the natives, they decide to found their settlement up the coast at a place they call Plymouth. Yet, the story goes, the future of the colony is very much in doubt during its first couple of months, because the Indians, rarely identified by tribe, on whom the English know they must depend for food and protection, seem to be at best wary and shy, and at worst, hostile. However, eventually the natives reach out to the newcomers through the interpreters Samoset and Squanto. The story sidesteps the obvious question of how these figures managed to learn English, nor does it explain why the natives suddenly became so friendly. The Indians' chief, Usamiquin, who the English know by his title Massasoit, akin to our Mr. President, even agrees to a treaty of alliance with Plymouth. Over the spring and summer, the Indians feed the Pilgrims and teach them how to plant corn and where to fish, whereupon the colony begins to thrive. That fall, the two parties seal their friendship with the famous First Thanksgiving. The peace that follows, according to the Thanksgiving myth, permits colonial New England, and by extension, modern America, to become blessed seats of freedom, democracy, Christianity, and plenty. As for what happens to the Indians next, this story has nothing to say. The natives' legacy is to present America as a gift to white people, or in other words, to concede to colonialism. Like Pocahontas and Sacagawea, the other famous Indians of early American history, they help the colonizers and then move off stage. The Wampanoags of what is now southeastern Massachusetts, who are the natives in this drama, have long contended that this tale is not history, but a myth that sugarcoats the viciousness of colonialism for indigenous people. My book reckons with this uncomfortable assertion and its implications. For instance, in traditional accounts of Thanksgiving, the Pilgrims step onto Plymouth Rock and into a new world or wilderness. Today, people still use these terms. But in fact, human civilization in the Americas was every bit as rich and ancient as in Europe or anywhere else on the globe. History did not begin for the Wampanoags with the arrival of the Mayflower. They already had a dynamic past, countless generations old, that shaped who they were and what they did. In other words, they inhabited an old world. And the so-called wilderness, if you will, in which the English arrived, was full of villages, roads, cornfields, historic monuments, cemeteries, and forests cleared of underbrush, all by Indian design. As you can see in this drawing of the Wampanoag community of Patuxet by the French explorer Samuel de Champlain in 1605, a full 15 years before the Pilgrim arrival. If you're having trouble discerning what you're seeing here, these are cornfields, and these are weetus or wigwams, Wampanoag houses. The Wampanoag's recent history mattered too. Though the Thanksgiving myth suggests that the Pilgrim-Wampanoag encounter was a first contact episode, in fact, It was just one in a string of bloody meetings between the Wampanoags and Europeans since 1524. So a full century before the Pilgrim arrival. And these contacts became particularly frequent from 1602 onward. And you can see the violence that took place during these encounters in yet another drawing by Samuel de Champlain. The Thanksgiving myth portrays the Wampanoags as timid and overawed by the Pilgrims. But I show that the Wampanoags were easily the stronger party during Plymouth's early years. The English did not dictate to the Wampanoags. Instead, the Wampanoags initially used Plymouth Colony as a pawn in their tribal and intertribal politics. More on that later. It will come as a surprise to most of my readers that the celebrated first Thanksgiving feast actually played a minor role in this relationship. It was practically a non-event. Far more influential in shaping the alliance were a series of other less palatable episodes filled with violence and power politics. I also submit that our emphasis on the nearly 50 years of peace following the first Thanksgiving and its associated treaty of 1621 elides the more important point, that the Wampanoags came to resent the colonists' aggressive and often underhanded expansion. The truth is that the English and the Wampanoags nearly came to blows repeatedly during the supposed long peace, and particularly after the death of Usamequin or Massasoit in 1660, culminating in the terrible King Philip's War of 1675-76. Most histories that bother to include the Wampanoags end with this war, but my book contends that accounting with the Thanksgiving myth as a white lie requires tracing Wampanoag struggles with colonialism through the centuries right up to the present day. And this perspective, I think, is especially urgent as modern America grapples with new manifestations of white nationalism, while at the very same time, Indigenous Americans in New England, and indeed all across the country, including California, are reasserting their political, economic, and cultural sovereignty. We need long-term historical perspectives to understand these developments. So to explore these themes and bring Wampanoag voices to the foreground, I want to focus this talk tonight around 3 cases spread across the centuries in which the Wampanoags or native people affiliated with them posed counter-narratives to white people's triumphalist histories. Our first revisionist historian is none other than the Wampanoag sachem, or chief, Pametacom, better known to history as King Philip. In the late spring of 1675, some 50 years after his father, Usamequin or Massasoit, had greeted the Pilgrims, Pametacom sat down to meet with a delegation of English magistrates from the colony of Rhode Island. So here's Wampanoag country. And this is where Pametacom's headquarters was located and where the meeting took place. The Rhode Islanders were there to encourage the sachem to agree to a peaceful arbitration of the Wampanoags' mounting tensions with Plymouth Colony. Yet Pametacom had already resolved to fight and agreed to this conference only to explain why. Let's consider what he said that day. And by the way, we're very fortunate that the leader of the Rhode Island delegation seems to have spoken Wampanoag and recorded this talk. And it resulted in one of the richest speeches on record by a Native American leader from this period. Pametacom viewed the history of Wampanoag-English relations as little more than the colonists' failure to live up to the promise of the 1621 alliance. The sachem recalled that when the Pilgrims first arrived at Plymouth 55 years earlier, Usamequin, and I quote here, was as a great man, and the English as a little child. Pametacom contended that Usamequin, whose mark you see here on a land deed, could have wiped out the infant colony if he had wished. Instead, he held back its many native enemies, including Wampanoags, fed the starving colonists, and granted them land. Now, Plymouth conveniently left out that his father had made this choice less out of altruism than a need for allies. For you see, the Wampanoags had been hobbled by a plague between 1616 and 1619. We don't know what the disease was. I suspect it was smallpox. We're just not sure. But what we do know is that the Wampanoags' Narragansett rivals to the west did not contract the disease, whereupon the Narragansetts took advantage of the Wampanoags' weakness to begin subjugating them to the status of tributaries. So Usamequin looks to the English as possible allies to help fend off the Narragansett threat. Plymouth also overlooked his father's desire to become the point man in trade with the English in order to consolidate his authority over the loose Wampanoag polity. But generally, Plymouth was right that Plymouth would have become yet another English lost colony, and there were plenty of them during this era, if it had not been for Wampanoag largesse. And how did Plymouth show its gratitude decades later, now that it had become the great man? Well, Plymouth, whose mark you see here, the English called him Philip, Plymouth cited the example that in 1662, Plymouth had seized, and he alleged, fatally poisoned his brother, Wamsutta, or Alexander, because the English feared that he was plotting an anti-colonial league. I actually think they were right. More recently, the English had used Christian Indian testimony to arrest, try, and execute 3 of Plymouth's men for the supposed murder of another Christian Indian, John Sassaman, who had been leaking sensitive Wampanoag intelligence to colonial authorities. To Plymouth Colony's executions of the accused Sassaman murderers and its presumed assassination of his brother Wamsutta were bad enough as discrete events. But worse still was that they crystallized a vast array of English wrongs. Plymouth denounced that in English courts, and I quote, "If 20 honest Indians testified that an Englishman had done them wrong, it was as nothing. And if but one of the worst Indians testified against any Indian suspected by the English, that was sufficient." The English had begun to interfere in criminal matters between Wampanoags within Wampanoag territory. Plymouth railed that, and I quote, "Whatever was only between Indians and not in English townships, they would not have us prosecute." About half of the Wampanoags, mostly on Cape Cod and the islands of Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, had adopted Christianity and sworn off Plymouth's leadership, as well as the responsibility to pay him tribute, fearing no reprisal from the sachem because they enjoyed English protection. By the way, if you're having trouble discerning what you're seeing here, this is a page from the first Bible ever printed in North America. It's in the Wampanoag language. And what you're seeing here is marginalia, so writings in the margins, by Wampanoag people who had acquired literacy in their own language. The Wampanoag language had not been alphabetized before the English arrived, but they learned literacy in their language in mission schools, and started by the English, but eventually taken over by Wampanoag people. I find these documents incredibly powerful. But to Plymouth, the adoption of Christianity by some Wampanoag people was political interference. And there were other issues as well. The English used land deeds, some fair but many foul, to claim Wampanoag territory for their own exclusive use under their own exclusive jurisdiction. Well, this ran contrary to the natives' expectation that their land sales merely conveyed permission for the English to settle among them. Or in other words, for the English to become part of Wampanoag society. When native people resisted, colonists flooded the contested tracts with livestock and slapped any native people who injured the animals with trumped up criminal fines and lawsuits. The point was to force holdout natives to release their claims and resign themselves to the English interpretation of these sales. Such machinations gave the colonists, as Pameticon put it, and I quote again, 100 times more land now than the king, meaning Pameticon himself, had for his people. To the Wampanoags then, English law was but a shakedown by people with short memories and thin loyalty. Given these patterns, Pameticon asked rhetorically, why would he put any faith in the negotiated settlement proposed by Rhode Island? History taught that the English would just use some technical violation as an excuse to confiscate his land and even murder him. The Rhode Islanders, seeing where this conversation was headed, cautioned Pameticon that it would be suicidal for the Wampanoags to resort to arms, because, they said, the English were too strong for them. In that case, the sachem retorted, then the English should do to them, the Wampanoags, as they did when they were too strong for the English. In other words, he called on the colonists to assume the role of the great man by acting with generosity, restraint, and justice toward the Wampanoag little child. And that's where this conference ended, because everyone knew this wish was futile. Just days later, Pameticon led a Wampanoag force against nearby English towns, prompting a war that would engulf the entire region and ultimately break the back of indigenous power in southern New England. This war is the most basic feature of the Wampanoag-English relationship that the Thanksgiving myth studiously ignores. Initially, Wampanoag resistance fighters got the best of it by repeatedly sacking exposed English settlements and ambushing troops on the march. Furthermore, soon they had the support of the Nipmucks of central Massachusetts, the Narragansetts of Rhode Island, and the Pecumtucks and Secokis of the upper Connecticut River Valley, whom the colonists turned into enemies by violating their neutrality, such as attempting to confiscate their arms or trying to force them to turn over Wampanoag non-combatants who had taken refuge with them. The English made things even worse for themselves by treating the thousands of Christian Indians who pledged fealty to the colonies at the beginning of this war as wolves in sheep's clothing. Massachusetts and Plymouth herded Christian Indians into island concentration camps, where the people suffered malnutrition and exposure. The warring Indians took advantage of these colonial missteps to accumulate victories in which they took the lives of upwards of 3,000 Englishmen, destroyed 16 colonial towns, and slaughtered 800 head of cattle. Eventually, however, the resistance collapsed, in no small part because other native people threw in their lot with the English. So let's focus our attention on this part of the map here. This would be around the modern day border of Massachusetts and New York State. Here you have the Hudson River. In February of 1676, the Mohawk Nation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, or Iroquois League, as a gesture of alliance to the young English colony of New York, drove Pameticon's winter camp away from Dutch and French gun markets on the Hudson River and eastward, back into the teeth of colonial New England forces. So along this path, let me get my cursor here, right here. And also lying in wait among the English were the Mohegans and the Pequots of Connecticut and Christian Wampanoags from Cape Cod, who, under duress, had sided with the colonies from the beginning and were just as adept at forest warfare as the resistance fighters. Meanwhile, the warring Indians and their families were stalked by hunger and disease as they lived in cramped quarters, on the run, away from their cornfields and fishing stations. Consequently, by the late spring of 1676, growing numbers of them began to accept a late English offer of quarter in exchange for switching sides. Others managed to avoid this terrible choice by escaping to the upper Hudson River Valley or Canada, where they built new lives. But most of them never made it that far. By June 1676, so a year into the war, Native prisoners were telling their English captors that Plymouth was, and I quote, "ready to die, for you have now killed or taken all his relations," and almost broke his heart. Those relations included his wife, Watunakunuski, and their son, we don't know his name, who colonists captured and sold into the horrors of Caribbean slavery. They were but two of an estimated 2,000 Indians, men, women, and children alike, who the English sentenced to slavery in this war. And not only in New England, but as far away as the West Indies, Gibraltar, and Tangier. Some of these poor souls had surrendered based on English promises of mercy, only to discover that the terms were harsher than colonial officials had pledged. Worse still, some surrendering natives discovered too late that colonial authorities would not spare any Indian person they suspected of having taken an English life. Massachusetts, Plymouth, and Rhode Island held public executions throughout the summer and fall of 1676, including 50 hangings on Boston Common alone, an event that this public space has yet to memorialize. The English even exacted retribution on the dead. On August 6, colonial forces discovered the drowned body of Weetamoo, a female sachem and war leader, and the sister of Plymouth's wife. Authorities ordered her head to be severed and piked next to a holding pen full of Wampanoag prisoners. The captives, according to English accounts, made a most horrid and diabolical lamentation, crying out, it was their queen's head. A few days after this incident, Plymouth was dead too, shot down by a Christian Indian the English called alderman. Filled with a vengeful spirit, Captain Benjamin Church had the sachem dismembered and his head sent to Plymouth. There, on the very site where Plymouth's father had allied and feasted with the Pilgrims in what we now call the first Thanksgiving, authorities mounted their grisly trophy outside the town gate and left it there to rot for the next 20 years. It might have been one of the last things that Plymouth's wife saw when Plymouth shipped her from her homeland into slavery. Later that week, Plymouth held a day of Thanksgiving in praise of God for saving the colony from its enemies. I think we can all agree these horrors are as contrary to the traditional Thanksgiving story as it gets. Though history rarely pays attention to the Wampanoags after King Philip's War, my book emphasizes that this conflict was just the first stage in a centuries-long battle to defend their land and sovereignty. It should come as no surprise to any of you that the English seized nearly all of the Wampanoags' territory in the decades after the war, leaving only a handful of town-sized reservations for mostly Christian Indians. Please note, by the way, I didn't frame this process as the Wampanoags losing their land, as if by mistake. Let's be clear. Colonists and their successors took it. The English also seized the Wampanoags as bound laborers. From the late 1600s through the mid-1800s, white merchant creditors, courts, and government-appointed guardians colluded to force the Wampanoags and their children into indentured servitude to white farmers, householders, and whaling merchants. The terms often lasted several years and even decades. Such debt peonage and court-ordered servitude made it nearly impossible for the Wampanoags to sustain their normal social patterns, including the process of raising their own children, to the point that few Wampanoags could speak their ancestral language by the mid-1800s. Enter William Apess, the Pequot-born preacher to the Wampanoags of the town of Mashpee on Cape Cod. And Apess is our second native figure after Pametacom to dispute white Americans' self-serving, sanitized histories. In 1836, right in the midst of Jacksonian Indian removal, Apess wrote his Eulogy on King Philip, which used a revisionist account of the Pilgrim Saga to call attention to the plight of indigenous people in New England and beyond. In it, Apess argued that Indians were the real heroes of Plymouth's founding because they comported themselves like real Christians, whereas the supposedly saintly pilgrims behaved like villains and hypocrites. Apess, and by the way, he's speaking before a white audience in Boston when he made this speech. He meticulously laid out how the pilgrims had introduced themselves to the Wampanoags by desecrating their graves and looting their corn, then had the audacity to turn to Usamiquin for help. Yet the chief, to his moral credit, obliged, like a true Christian, imbued with the principles of charity and forgiveness. No people could be used better than they were, Apess intoned. The Wampanoags gave the English venison and sold them many hogsheads of corn. Had it not been for this humane act of the Indians, every white man would have been swept from the New England colonies. Apess also contended that Massasoit's son, Pametacom, was, and I quote, the greatest man that ever lived upon the American shores. Apess even ranked him higher than my university's namesake, George Washington, because the sachem fought against a darker tyranny and for greater freedom with far fewer means at his disposal. In Apess's telling, Pametacom was no misguided hothead for taking up arms. Rather, he was a sage, because he foresaw, and I quote, that the white people would not only cut down their groves, but would enslave them. And how true the prophecy. Our groves and hunting grounds are gone, are dead, are dug up, our council fires are put out. It was all an outgrowth, Apess emphasized, of a fire, a canker, created by the pilgrims from across the Atlantic to burn and destroy my poor, unfortunate brethren. In light of this sordid history, Apess proposed that Indians should treat each December 22nd, the anniversary of the Pilgrims landing in Plymouth, and every 4th of July as, and I quote, days of mourning and not joy. Let them rather fast and pray to the Great Spirit, the Indians' God, who deals out mercy to his red children and not destruction. This call by Apess for Native people to commemorate that they bore the burden of white America's triumphs would continue to resonate with the Wampanoags long after he was gone. Less than 40 years later, in the late 1860s and early 1870s, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts addressed the stubborn refusal of the Wampanoags to disappear by dissolving their reservations of Mashpee, Heron Pond, Gayhead, Chappaquiddick, Christiantown, and others. The state divided the common lands of these places into private property tracts, subjected those lands to taxation and confiscation for debt, and declared the inhabitants to be full-fledged citizens and no longer Indians, as if the two were antithetical. White officials congratulated themselves that they had bestowed legal equality on Indians, just as white New Englanders were pressuring white Southerners to do with Black freedmen and women under Reconstruction. They refused to listen to the Wampanoags, who protested that the supposed gift of citizenship was actually a Trojan horse to rob them of their remaining land and force them to scatter. And that was indeed the point. White proponents of this measure, at their more honest moments, admitted that they considered the Wampanoags to be too racially intermixed to be classified as Indians any longer, and that in any case, it was the fate of Indians to vanish. Over the next century, white Americans did everything they could to make that supposedly natural process occur, including reducing Indians to romantic bit parts in the country's history, as exemplified in the Thanksgiving myth. Throughout the colonial era, Thanksgiving had no association whatsoever with Pilgrims and Indians. Let me emphasize that point. Throughout the 1600s and the 1700s, and indeed into the 1800s, no one associated the Thanksgiving holiday with the story of Pilgrims and Indians. The link between the holiday and the history appears to date to 1841, which was when the Reverend Alexander Young published a primary source account of the 1621 harvest feast hosted by Plymouth Colony and attended by neighboring Wampanoags. And here, by the way, is the account. By the way, this is almost the entire primary source record relating to the first Thanksgiving. Well, to this primary source account, Young added an influential footnote. And trust me, as a historian, there aren't a lot of influential footnotes out there. This was one of them. And in this footnote, Young wrote, "This was the first Thanksgiving, the harvest festival of New England." Well, over the next 50 years, various authors, artists, and lecturers, including John Quincy Adams and Thoreau and Emerson, disseminated Young's idea until Americans took it for granted. Now, predictably, New Englanders were the first to tout the Pilgrims as national founders, and their dinner with Indians as the template for Thanksgiving. But for the rest of the country to go along, the nation first had to subjugate the tribes of the Great Plains and Far West. Only then could white people stop vilifying Indians as bloodthirsty savages and give them an unthreatening role in a national founding myth. The Pilgrim Saga also took hold at this time because it was useful in the nation's culture wars. It was no coincidence that the Pilgrims emerged as founding fathers amid popular anxiety that the United States was being overrun by immigrants. Catholics from Ireland and Germany, and later Jews from Eastern Europe, supposedly unappreciative of the country's Protestant democratic origins and values. Additionally, treating the Pilgrims as the epitome of colonial America, as the norm, served to minimize the country's record of racial oppression, past and present. Better to highlight the Pilgrims' religious and democratic principles instead of the Indian wars and slavery more typical of colonies. Through such means, Northeasterners could define the so-called Black and Indian problems as Southern and Western exceptions to an otherwise inspiring national heritage. So what I'm saying here is that though Americans eventually assumed that the Thanksgiving holiday had been associated with Pilgrims and Indians since 1621, the tradition was a product of white Protestants in the 19th century, particularly Yankees, asserting their cultural authority over European immigrants, Americans of color, and other regions of the United States. This invention became tradition by the early 20th century and has remained so in no small part through American schools holding annual Thanksgiving pageants in which students dress up as Pilgrims and Indians to reenact the first Thanksgiving. I'm going to admit, I myself remember participating in such a performance in which we sang "My Country 'Tis of Thee." I'm not going to impose my singing on you, but in it, we praised America as a sweet land of liberty and called the Pilgrims my fathers. The point of this exercise was to have a diverse group of school children learn about who we as Americans are, or at least who we're supposed to be. Even students from ethnic backgrounds would be instilled with the principles of representative government, liberty, and Christianity, while learning to identify with English colonists as fellow whites. Leaving Indians outside the category of my fathers also carried important lessons. It was yet another reminder about which race ran the country and whose values mattered. Lest we dismiss the impact of these messages, let's consider the experience of a young Wampanoag woman who told me that when she was in grade school, the lone Indian in her class, her teacher cast her as Chief Massasoit in one of these pageants and had her sing, "This land is your land. This land is my land." At the time, she was just embarrassed. Now, as an adult, she sees the cruel irony in all of it. Other Wampanoags have told me about their parents objecting to these pageants and associated history lessons that the New England Indians were all gone, only to have school officials question their claims to be Indian. Authentic Indians were supposed to be primitive relics frozen in some kind of Stone Age existence, not modern. So what were they doing in school? Speaking English, wearing contemporary clothing, and returning home to adults who had jobs and drove cars, shopped at the supermarket. By 1970, Frank James, the third in our sequence of Native revisionist historians, had reached the limits of his patience with this nonsense. James was born and raised in the community of Aquinnah, or Gayhead on Martha's Vineyard, which had long ranked as one of the poorest communities in Massachusetts. Nevertheless, James grew up determined to succeed and represent his people. As a teenager, he even adopted the Wampanoag name Wamsutta, after the eldest son of Usamequin, who preceded Pametacom in calling on the Wampanoags to resist colonialism. James's inner drive carried him all the way to the New England Conservatory of Music in Boston, where he studied trumpet, and then to the Nauset Regional Schools on Cape Cod, where he became director of music. Yet his passion was political activism and the study of Wampanoag history, for he understood that the past was critical to reforming the present. And what he read in the primary sources made his blood boil, because the information there bore little relation to the Thanksgiving myth that weighed around his people's neck like a millstone. So when James was invited to speak at a state banquet celebrating the 350th anniversary of Plymouth's founding, he saw it as a rare opportunity to set the story straight. Yet when he submitted a draft of his speech for review, white officials rejected it as too inflammatory. James, for his part, found an alternative script drawn up by the state to be so childish and untrue that he pulled out of the event altogether. Instead, he drew up plans for a commemoration in which there would be no censors. Inspired by the Red Power movement for Indigenous rights and justice, James organized a national day of mourning to be held on Thanksgiving Day, 1970, at the site of the Massasoit statue overlooking Plymouth Rock. In choosing this name, James hearkened not only to the national days of mourning held after the assassinations of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King, he also reached back to William Apess's eulogy on King Philip. And like Apess incarnate, when James's moment came, he rose up before protesters from all across Indian country, media, and onlookers, and delivered that inflammatory speech that Massachusetts had tried to repress. He began with the poignant assertion that he had the right to the dignity of his humanity, despite society's efforts to diminish him and his people. I speak to you as a man, he stressed, a Wampanoag man. I'm a proud man, proud of my ancestry, my accomplishments won by strict parental direction, despite his family and community suffering poverty and discrimination, two social and economic diseases. He acknowledged to his white listeners that Thanksgiving, and I quote, is a time of celebration for you, celebrating the beginnings of the white man in America. For James and the Wampanoags, however, the day had doleful implications. It is with a heavy heart, he explained, that I look back on what happened to my people. Like Apess, James proceeded to tell a history of English-Wampanoag relations that turned the bedtime story of the Thanksgiving myth into a nightmare. His conclusion was that Usamequin's welcome of the Pilgrims was perhaps our biggest mistake. We, the Wampanoags, welcomed you, the white man, with open arms, little knowing that it was the beginning of the end. That before 50 years were to pass, the Wampanoag would no longer be a free people. To James, like Pometicon, like Apess, the moral of the first Thanksgiving was that the English and their white successors had betrayed the Wampanoags who befriended them at their time of need. This is the message that is echoed through subsequent national days of mourning, which the United American Indians of New England have continued to hold each Thanksgiving right up to the present day. The question for all of us was and is how to move forward. The answer, according to James, is to confront this history, including the fact, as he put it, that the Wampanoags still walk the lands of Massachusetts. James urged his fellow Americans to consider Indians as worthy of the same respect as everyone else. Let us remember, he counseled, the Indian is and was as human as the white man. The Indian feels pain, gets hurt, and becomes defensive, has dreams, bears tragedy, suffers from loneliness, needs to cry as well as laugh. If the American people followed this counsel to extend their native countrymen and women basic compassion and acknowledgement, it would make Thanksgiving Day 1970 a new beginning toward what James called a more humane America, a more Indian America, in which Native people could, and I quote again, regain the position in this country that is rightfully ours. There are so many reasons for Americans to follow James's lead and attempt to tell the history of Plymouth and Thanksgiving with three-dimensional Wampanoags at the center. Thanksgiving eclipses Columbus Day as a focal point for considering the Native American role in the nation's past. It's bad enough to have gotten the story so wrong for so long. It's inexcusable to continue the annual tradition of having teachers, politicians, and television producers traffic in the Thanksgiving myth, and residential homes and shopping centers sport decorations of happy pilgrims and Indians. These practices dismiss Native people's real historical traumas at white hands in favor of depicting their ancestors as having consented to colonialism. To call the consequences harmless is to ignore the chorus of Native Americans, our fellow Americans, who say the hurt is profound, particularly to their children. I think we can agree this population has already suffered far more than its fair share in the creation of the United States. I should also emphasize that Native people have contributed disproportionately to the military in every single one of the nation's wars, beginning with the Revolution. In a pluralistic country, it's morally unacceptable to allow the celebration of a national holiday to damage part of the nation's people. Never mind the first people. Or for that matter, all of the people. Whereas the identity politics of marginalized groups tends to focus on achieving justice and equality, or in the Native case, sovereignty as well, white identity politics has always centered on oppressing others. Yet there's been too little public reflection on how the Thanksgiving myth teaches white proprietorship of the nation. Why should a school-age child with the name of, say, Silverman identify more with the Pilgrims than the Indians? After all, such a student is unlikely to descend from either group, and the descendants of both groups are Silverman's fellow Americans. If the student is taught to think of both Pilgrims and Indians more dispassionately as they instead of we, as historians do, it might be a step towards a more critical understanding of history in which all of the actors can be seen as fully human, with the virtues and shortcomings that one would expect to find in any population. At the same time, if the student is taught to think of both groups more inclusively as we, aware of the associated risk of appropriation, it might be a step towards a more compassionate national culture. Boy, could we use it. This vision would have school curriculums treat Native American history as basic to an understanding of American history in general. Such lessons would address the civilizations Indigenous people created over thousands of years before the arrival of Europeans, the ways they've suffered under and resisted colonization, and how they've managed to survive the apocalypse and adapt to modern life while maintaining their distinct identities and defending their Indigenous rights. Units on American government would address the sovereignty of Indian tribes as basic to American federalism. I'm not suggesting for a moment that these steps are easy. They're not easy at all. Confronting the Native American past challenges a great many myths that so many Americans hold dear. It takes past figures that we consider to be heroes and exposes them sometimes as villains or at least as deeply flawed heroes. It weakens the white hold on the nation's cultural patrimony. It threatens to tear down monuments and rename buildings. But confronting this past also offers to shed light, to make us a bit more humble. And I think most importantly, to signal to Native people that the country values them as us. As one gracious Wampanoag elder once told me, we do ourselves no good by hiding from the truth. And I think she was talking about all of us. Amen.
Thank you, Professor, for that wonderful talk. It was truly engaging and informative. If you want, you can leave that last slide up so people could get that information on your book.
Sure.
And we did receive a few questions throughout your presentation. If anybody else has any other questions, please type that into the chat and we will ask for you. So the first one I have is there restoration for the Wampanoags?
Is there restoration? Well, that is a difficult one to address in this particular environment. So the Wampanoag people, as I mentioned in the talk, saw Massachusetts seize their common lands and divide them up in the 1860s and 1870s and declare that these people were no longer legally Indians. And in the century plus after that development, just as the Wampanoags had predicted, white people seized most of their lands. And whenever these folks fell into debt or failed to pay their taxes, the state or their creditors would seize the property. But in the 1970s, things began to change. The federal government, particularly under Jimmy Carter, became more open to extending federal recognition to small Native communities along the East Coast, and for that matter in California, who most of their white neighbors had assumed had gone extinct, disappeared, no longer existed. And so after really long ordeals in the courts and in the government bureaucracy, first the Wampanoag community of Aquinnah or Gayhead, from which Frank James came, acquired federal recognition, and the federal government then provided the community with resources so they could start reacquiring land and putting it in trust as a federal Indian reservation. They reorganized their tribal government and launched all kinds of entrepreneurial initiatives and the like. The Wampanoag community of Mashpee on Cape Cod followed the same course, and it took a lot longer for them to gain federal recognition, but they finally got it in the year 2007. That is, until last year, when Trump's Department of the Interior took Mashpee's land out of trust because a number of casino lobbyists who were close with the president didn't want the potential competition from a casino that the Mashpee Wampanoags wanted to open. Let's keep in mind, they've been among the poorest communities in the entire Northeast for centuries. So, my hope is that with the change of administration, the federal government will put Mashpee's territory back in trust. But in the meantime, the tribe has been thrown into chaos by this decision.
Wow. Thank you.
Devorah, sorry, very quickly, somebody included in the chat that about a question about reparations that I think is the person asked, did they mean, and I think the original question, did it mean reparations? So I thought maybe this would be a good time to tack that question.
Well, let me just say this. Most Native people that I've talked to and read about don't call for reparations, but what they call for is the federal government to honor the terms of treaties that it negotiated with Native people under crassly unequal circumstances, but just to honor those unequal agreements, which the federal government has failed to do over the centuries. The federal government stole Native American land across the continent, forced Native people to live on reservations, and promised Native people that it would make those reservations decent places to live. It would provide them with the resources in exchange for the land it took from them, make these places decent places to live. Well, if you know anything about the state of Indian country, I think too often, I think the white public has this caricature image of Native people as all having casinos, right? And all riding high on the hog. The statistics from Indian country are dismal. Native people suffer violence at the hands of police more than any other minority group in the country. They have the lowest poverty rate, or rather the highest poverty rate in the country, the highest suicide rate, highest substance abuse rate, lowest life expectancy rate. And I could go on with a series of dismal statistics. Native people just want the federal government to live up to its obligations. And let me emphasize here, this is a point that we're not taught in civics, but we should be. Indian treaties negotiated with the federal government and ratified by the Senate are, under our Constitution, the supreme law of the land. Senate ratified treaties are the supreme law of the land. The fact that the federal government hasn't honored the supreme law of the land over the centuries is neither here nor there. It is still the supreme law of the land. And so living up to those obligations is more than just a matter of good morals. It's a matter of law.
All right. Thank you, Jose, for bringing that up. The next question, was this early history of killings and taking of land recorded by the Wampanoags and or English colonists?
Well, the Wampanoag certainly remembered it. Wampanoag people, though they began to acquire literacy in their own language in the 17th century and actually achieved remarkably high rates of literacy, given that they started from zero, didn't record histories. That wasn't their way. Their way of remembering the past was oral history. You tell stories through the generations. And let's be clear, some of this history was so painful that they didn't tell it. It was just too hurtful to recount. But it was so prevalent that the English themselves recorded the details. And in some cases, the English did this unaware that we would be judging them harshly many generations from now. I mean, most English colonists were 100% confident that God was on their side, that as civilized people, they had the right to lord it over people that they considered to be savages. That as Christian people, they had the right to lord it over people they considered to be pagans. And so, they recorded these land deeds, they recorded the court cases, they recorded the executions. And, one of the things that I think is quite striking, because there's a widespread assumption that English people were so biased that you can't possibly recover native voices from records that they controlled. It's not true. I'm not suggesting for a minute that these records are utterly transparent and that they tell us the whole story of Wampanoag or other Native American experiences during this point. But Native people were important in colonial America. If you read the records of any colony from this period, the entry in the index that's longest is Indians. Native people were most of the people in colonial America, overwhelmingly, and they controlled most of the continent into the 1840s. They were economic powers with which to be reckoned, military powers, political powers, and the like. And as a result, they were engaged constantly with colonial and later white American authorities. And they had an incredible knack for getting their point across, much like Pametacom in that early exchange between between himself and the Rhode Islanders. The Rhode Islanders did not want to hear that speech, but they did hear it, and they recorded it. And thankfully for us, we can use it to reflect on this critical period.
You started to touch on it a little bit in your previous answer, but the next question we had is, how did the Pilgrims reconcile their conduct towards the Native Americans with their Christian faith? How did they justify this treatment? And a third part of the question, has a formal apology been issued by the state?
With the last question, I don't know. That would be interesting to know. I'll look into it. How did they reconcile this treatment with their faith? Well, so I'll say this. What we often see as contradictory behavior by early modern European Christians, they didn't see as inconsistent whatsoever. So what they would have said is, look, the Spanish, and the English are always comparing themselves to the Spanish of a century prior. They said, look, the Spanish came in and started massacring these people and forcing them to convert to Catholicism at the point of the sword, and then enslaved them by the hundreds of thousands, and produced an incredible drop in the native population of Central and South America and the West Indies. We, the Pilgrims, would say, do not propagate Christianity at the point of the sword. We encourage Native people to adopt it, but they can take it or leave it. They said that they bought their land rather than seizing it from Native people, except in the case of war. And by and large, actually, that is true. That doesn't mean that these negotiations for land took place under what we would consider to be just circumstances. Native people complained endlessly that the English would try to run them into debt or would try to ply them with liquor in order to get them to sign these land deeds that they didn't fully understand. But I think the bigger point is this, that the English, like every other European imperial power during this period, never thought for a moment that their relationship with Native people would be one of co-equals once Europeans had enough power to start forcing their will on indigenous people. Europeans saw themselves, by virtue of their civility and Christianity, civility as they defined it, as superior, and believed that other peoples with whom they came into contact needed to be subjugated and brought under that way of life, much as English people's ancestors had been brought under that way of life by the Romans. I mean, they saw all of this as just part of a cyclical history. This is not to say that there weren't critics of their behavior within English society and certainly from native society. Roger Williams, the founder of Rhode Island, who had to flee Massachusetts because it was persecuting him for his religious principles, he said quite pointedly that the colonists of Plymouth and Massachusetts were creating an idol. And by the way, Puritans don't like idols. They associate idols with Catholicism and they define themselves against Catholicism. But he said, look, the English of New England are creating an idol out of God land, much as God gold became the idol of the Spaniards. So, there is a debate within colonial society about this behavior, but it wasn't enough to sway the behavior of the majority.
All right, and I'm going to turn to Jose. Did we have any other questions pop up in the chat?
Yeah, we did have a few more questions. There was one about Roger Williams and how he played into the story. And I know you just touched on him, but I guess if there are any other interesting details about his role in the history and the story that you've shared with us.
Sure. I mean,
question asker would welcome that. Yeah.
On the sliding scale of colonialism, Roger Williams is one of the good guys. He flees Massachusetts along with other religious dissenters drummed out of Massachusetts or Plymouth or Connecticut, and creates actually the first colony that's truly was dedicated to religious freedom. Plymouth is not, contrary to the Thanksgiving myth that these people cross the Atlantic for religious freedom, they did not believe in religious freedom the way that we understand it. They believed religious freedom for themselves, but they wanted to set up their own religiously intolerant society. Roger Williams, though, truly believed in religious freedom. In Rhode Island, you could practice any faith you wanted or no faith at all. Didn't mean that Roger Williams liked it. It just meant that he believed truly in the separation of church and state. And Rhode Island was deliberately located right in between the Wampanoags to the east and the Narragansetts to the west. Both tribes wanted to place an English community in between their locations to serve as a buffer for raids between both groups. In this position, Roger Williams and Rhode Island, they were surrounded by much more numerous native people right up to the 1870s. And so Rhode Island tended to behave much better than Massachusetts, which had a massive population, or even Connecticut, which could be rather overwielding with native people. Nevertheless, when it came time for King Philip's War, Rhode Island sided with Massachusetts and Connecticut and Plymouth. And as a result, midway through the war, native forces attacked Providence, the capital of Rhode Island, and burned Roger Williams' house to the ground, with him sitting there talking to native people in their own language, saying, "What are you doing? I've hosted you in my home. I've written letters for you. I've advocated for you." And in short, what they said to him is, "Yeah, but you're still part of the problem. You didn't side with us when it came right down to it." And I think that's a powerful symbol of colonialism in Indian country.
Great, thanks for expanding on that. Next question. Would you change the purpose of the national celebration of Thanksgiving to a day of giving thanks and removing all connection to the Pilgrim and Native Americans? So it seems like it's about, is it possible to kind of disassociate the holiday from the history?
I love Thanksgiving. I mean, I love getting together with family and friends and offering thanks for what's good in my life. By the way, most Wampanoag people I know feel the same way. What they say is we should do that more often, and many of them do that more often than just in late November every year. We don't have to associate that wonderful ritual with this false history, and not only a false history, but a damaging history? There's no reason at all. Let me reiterate the point. For the better part of 2 centuries, white New Englanders celebrated Thanksgiving without invoking Pilgrims and Indians whatsoever. There's no it's a fairly recent development to associate this mythical history with the holiday. So let's dispense with it. Because if we're not going to dispense with it, I say we have to get the history right. And no one's going to feel like holding a holiday if they're going to talk about some of the material that we've covered here today. It's truly depressing. I also don't want to see Native American history relegated to November every year, Native American History Month. The greater challenge is to integrate Native American history into the mainstream of American history, not have it appear in cameo. Native people have been critical to the history of the colonies and the United States from the very beginning. And just as the country has taken massive strides towards integrating African American history into mainstream history curriculum since the 1960s, I think it's high time to start doing the same with Indigenous people.
Thank you. I am watching the time here too, and there's a question I thought was really interesting that maybe you can answer relatively quickly. Who are some Wampanoag historians who you might recommend we can read or look into? Is there anyone you would recommend?
2 of my favorites are cousins, Paula Peters and Ramona Peters of Mashpee, both just incredibly thoughtful people. And Paula in particular has given multiple speeches over the years. She's directed films. She's written short pieces, and Ramona has spoken publicly many times over the years. If you go to YouTube, you'll find their videos online. From the Aquinnah Wampanoag community, Linda Coombs has been a terrific spokesperson for things historical from Wampanoag country. Likewise, her relative Darius Coombs, who runs the Wampanoag program at Plymouth Plantation, and is a just incredibly knowledgeable, eloquent, and very patient. You have to be patient when you're dealing with tourists in his capacity. So I'd recommend looking him up. And finally, there's the brother-sister pair, Jonathan Perry and Elizabeth Lewis Perry, both from the Aquinnah Wampanoag community, who really know their history and are very good at sharing what they know with the public.
Great, thank you. So the next question, what can parents who are concerned about what their kids learn about history, whether it be from school, the media, so forth, what can they actually do to make sure their kids know the truth?
You can buy This Land Is Their Land and have them read it front to back. That's a start. This is an all hands on deck kind of question, because the issue of teaching children this very difficult history is more than just a matter of helping our primary and secondary school history and social studies teachers bone up on their content knowledge. The curriculum has to change, and the pressure to change the curriculum to integrate Native American history has to come from 2 different directions. I think fundamentally it has to come from the public. It has to come from the parents, who will insist that they're not going to allow their kids to be indoctrinated this way. Leaving Native people out of US history education is racial indoctrination. It is a way to sanitize the history of the United States, frankly, to make white people feel more comfortable. But from the bottom up, that won't be enough. History curriculums are very often dictated from the top down. And so this is a political issue as well as a moral issue and a civics issue. So what I'm suggesting is we need to have a community-wide discussion and community-wide activism to implement this kind of change. Now, in your own house, there's lots of things you can do. I mean, you can educate yourself on these matters and review your children's history lessons with them and tell them when you think that they're not getting the full story. I do that with my kids all the time. They hate it, by the way. There's nothing worse than having a father who's a historian. But all of you can fulfill that role within your own household. So I think that's the best way to start. I think, and let me just add one more thing. You do this with all kids everywhere. And I think all of us as citizens should do this. Insist that your kids know which native people's land they live on. Start local. Who are the indigenous people of this place? Where are they now? Are they still here as an intact community? If they're not, why not? We should all be able to explain the indigenous history of where we live.
Thank you for that response. Our next question is about genealogy research in particular. And so the person with this question asked, as I conduct my genealogy research and discover white ancestors who contributed to the genocide of Indian people, what do you recommend the best way to record this truth?
What's the best way to record this truth? Well, that's a good question. I mean, that's really a personal matter. Let me just offer my reflections on the use or non-use of guilt when confronting this history. Guilt will get you nowhere in coming to terms with this history. And what I say to people is this: our nation, and indeed our own family histories, it's like inheriting a house. And you're not responsible for the condition of the house when you inherit it. You didn't spruce it up and you didn't damage it. But when you inherit that house, what you're inheriting is not only what's wonderful about the structure, you're inheriting what needs repair. And if you ignore the rot that's been festering in the house, the whole edifice is going to collapse at one point or another. Don't put off maintenance. And so I think confronting the truth of history is like tending to the maintenance of our house. It is not the job of history. And I know for genealogists, look, all of us want to be proud of our ancestors. All of us want to. But let me promise you, this is a basic historical truism. All of our ancestors at one point or another were scoundrels. All of our ancestors at one point or another were either slaves or enslaved. All of them. They murdered and they advocated. No one has a pure genealogy. So don't look back on the past to cultivate patriotism and to cultivate pride in family. Real history is hard. Real history challenges people. It's hurtful in many cases. And by the way, in this story, that's true for the Wampanoags as well as the English. A lot of Wampanoags don't come out smelling like a rose from this history. What true history teaches us is how hard things have always been, how complicated things have always been, that human beings don't always act in accordance with their principles, in accordance with their own stated morals. That's a lesson we need to keep learning over and over and over again.
Thank you for that response there. We have one more question, and it is, can you speak about the Southern States Trail of Tears? You talked a little bit about, moving beyond King Philip's War and, into the 19th century. And perhaps you might have some thoughts on, other geographies, I guess, of this history.
Well, sure. I mean, the process of colonists and their white successors killing and subjugating and dispossessing Native people is, obviously not limited to New England. It was a continent-wide phenomenon, and it's a basic feature of the history of this country. And parts of the South have begun to confront this history by tracing the routes of Native people who white Americans normally associated with President Andrew Jackson, but it was multiple presidents who oversaw this policy. The process by which white Americans stole their land and forced them west of the Mississippi to what's now Oklahoma and Kansas. I have mixed feelings about these kinds of memorials. What I have been cheered about is the way that these trails of tears in the Southeast have often involved Native people in the planning process, and I think that's all well and good. What I worry about, though, with memorials like that and with historic memorials generally is white Americans have been insistent for centuries and continue to be today that Native people are relics of the past. And any historical discussion about Native people, because of that cultural freight, needs to be connected to an acknowledgement of Native people today, about where they are in the community, and if they're not in the community, why they're not, and where the descendants of the historical actors that we're considering are today. Because all of us need to be reconditioned to begin to see Indigenous people as modern people, as full members of our society. We're taught over and over again that whether it's through media or whether it's through historical amnesia, that these people belong to the past, and that their fate was destiny, that it was manifest destiny, it was willed by God. That's a racial ideology. That is racial conditioning. It is not true any more than the Thanksgiving myth is true. And so, we have light years to go to recognize our Native countrymen and women as full members of our society. And that includes treating their history thoroughly, honestly, and with respect in the context of a greater US history.
Thank you for that. That does it for the questions that I received. So, yeah.
Well, I think we're just at time, and we don't have time for any more questions, but Professor, if people wanted to contact you, could they use that email to ask you anything?
I'm not on social media, so that's the best way to contact me. Yes.
Okay, great. So please write that email down if you wanted to ask the professor any other questions. And thank you again to Professor Silverman. The recording will be made available on the California State Library YouTube channel, either at the end of this week or early next week in time for Thanksgiving. And a link will also be sent out via Eventbrite